What happens when one of Hollywood's most respected voices walks into a morning show interview, expecting a conversation, but instead finds himself under attack? In just 33 seconds, a simple question spiraled into a full-blown confrontation that shocked everyone watching. This is the story of how Good Morning America's set became a battleground, and how Morgan Freeman, a man known for his calm and measured presence, reached his breaking point and walked away from an interview that would become one of the most talked about moments in television history. It started like any other morning segment. The cameras were rolling. The lights were bright. The audience was settled in their seats, coffee cups in hand, ready to watch another celebrity interview. Morgan Freeman sat across from George Stephanopoulos, ready to discuss his latest project, a film he had poured his heart into. The atmosphere seemed normal, professional, just another day at the studio. But that facade shattered almost immediately, and what followed would leave everyone in the building absolutely stunned. George opened with what should have been a straightforward question about Morgan's career. But there was something in his tone, a subtle edge that caught Morgan off guard. It wasn't the friendly warmth you'd expect when greeting a guest of Morgan's caliber. It was colder, more calculated. Before Morgan could even finish his first answer, before he could get through a single thought, George cut him off, mid-sentence. "Hold on," George said, raising his hand dismissively. "I think we need to address something first. Something more important." Morgan paused, his expression shifting from warm and open to cautious and guarded. He had been in thousands of interviews over his decades-long career. He knew when something was off. "Address what exactly?" he asked carefully. George leaned forward in his chair, his posture aggressive, almost confrontational. His eyes had a glint that Morgan recognized. This wasn't about having a conversation. This was about creating a moment. "Your recent comments. The ones that caused quite a stir online. The ones that got people talking. Don't you think you owe people an explanation? Don't you think you need to clarify what you meant?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Morgan's jaw tightened slightly. This wasn't what he came here for. This wasn't the interview he agreed to. This wasn't what his team had been promised. He had been told they would talk about his film, about his career, about his craft. Instead, he was being ambushed on live television in front of millions of viewers. "George," Morgan said slowly, deliberately, choosing his words with the care of someone who knew this conversation was going to be dissected and analyzed. "I thought we were here to discuss my work. That's what I was told this interview would be about. That's what I agreed to." "We'll get to that," George replied dismissively, waving his hand as if Morgan's concerns were trivial. "But first, let's talk about what really matters. What people really want to know. What people are really talking about." There it was. The assumption that George knew what mattered more than the guest himself. The assumption that George's agenda was more important than the reason Morgan had come to the studio. Morgan felt his patience beginning to fray, thread by thread. "With all due respect," Morgan said, his voice still controlled, but with a hint of steel underneath. "I came here to have a conversation, not to be interrogated like I'm on trial. There's a difference between interviewing and attacking." George's face hardened at that. His smile, already forced, disappeared completely. "Interrogated? That's a strong word. I'm simply asking questions. Isn't that my job? Isn't that what journalists do?" "Your job," Morgan replied, his voice taking on a firmer tone, "is to have a dialogue, to have a conversation, not to create a spectacle, not to ambush people who came here in good faith." The tension in the studio was building with every exchange. You could feel it in the air, thick and heavy. You could see it in Morgan's eyes, in the way he sat straighter in his chair, his shoulders squared. The crew members behind the cameras were shifting uncomfortably, glancing at each other with worried expressions. George, however, seemed to be enjoying himself. He was getting the conflict he wanted. He pressed on, pushing harder. So you're saying you won't answer the question? You're refusing to address what people are concerned about? George challenged, his tone accusatory. I'm saying, Morgan responded, his voice rising slightly for the first time, that you're twisting this into something it's not. You're putting words in my mouth before I've even had a chance to speak. You're creating a narrative that doesn't exist. That's not journalism. That's manipulation. George actually scoffed. He scoffed on live television, in front of his guest, in front of millions of viewers. That's convenient, he said with a smirk. Avoid the hard questions by claiming I'm being unfair. That's a tactic we see all the time. Morgan stared at him, and in that stare was decades of experience, decades of wisdom, decades of watching people exactly like George think they were smarter than everyone else. The disrespect was unmistakable now. Here was a man who had spent his entire life building a legacy, earning respect through his work and his character, being treated like he was some controversial figure who needed to justify his existence to a morning show host. George, Morgan said, his tone colder now, ice forming around each word. You're not interested in my answers. You're not interested in the truth. You're interested in creating a moment. You're interested in getting a reaction. You're interested in making this about you, not about anything I have to say. That's ridiculous, George shot back quickly, defensively. I'm doing my job. Is it? Morgan challenged, leaning forward now himself. Because from where I'm sitting, this feels more like an attack than an interview. This feels more like you're trying to prove something than learn something. This feels like ego, not journalism. George's expression shifted. The confident smirk faltered for just a moment. He wasn't used to being called out like this. His guests usually played along, answered his questions with varying degrees of discomfort, smiled through whatever he threw at them. They needed the publicity. They needed the platform. But Morgan Freeman was not that kind of guest. He didn't need Good Morning America. He didn't need George Stephanopoulos. If you can't handle the questions, George said, his voice dripping with condescension, trying to regain control of the situation. If you can't deal with a little scrutiny, then maybe you shouldn't have agreed to come on the show. Maybe you should stick to scripts where you don't have to think on your feet. That was it. The line had been crossed. Not just crossed, but obliterated. Morgan's eyes narrowed, and something in his demeanor changed. The patience that had been holding everything together snapped. Handle the questions, Morgan repeated slowly, deliberately. George, I've been doing interviews longer than you've been on television. I've sat across from some of the greatest interviewers in the world. I've had conversations with people who actually cared about what I had to say. This isn't about handling questions. This is about respect. Something you clearly know absolutely nothing about. The crew behind the cameras shifted uncomfortably, their eyes wide. Several producers in the control room were leaning forward, watching their monitors with growing alarm. The audience sat in stunned, complete silence. George's face flushed red, the color creeping up from his collar. "Excuse me?" George said, his voice tight, strained. "What did you just say to me?" "You heard me perfectly well," Morgan said firmly, his voice steady and powerful. "You invited me here under false pretenses. You told my team this would be about my film, about my work. Instead, you're trying to turn this into some kind of gotcha journalism. You're trying to manufacture controversy where there is none. That's not journalism. That's ego. That's arrogance. That's disrespect." George leaned back in his chair, trying desperately to regain his composure, to look like he was still in control. "I think you're being overly sensitive. I think you're taking this too personally." "Sensitive?" Morgan's voice was sharp now, cutting through the studio like a blade. "No, George. What I'm being is honest. What I'm being is clear. You're treating me like I'm some scandal-hungry celebrity who needs to justify my existence on your show. You're treating me like I owe you something, like I owe your viewers something. I don't. I came here as a courtesy. I came here to share my work. And you've made it abundantly clear. That's not what you want. I'm not here for that. I won't be here for that. George tried to interject, his mouth opening to speak, but Morgan held up his hand, cutting him off with a gesture that somehow carried more authority than anything George had done the entire interview. Let me finish, Morgan said, his voice commanding, because I want to make sure you understand what I'm about to say. You sit here in your comfortable chair with your comfortable salary and your platform and your audience, and you think that gives you the right to talk down to people, to belittle them, to twist their words, to treat them like they're beneath you. Well, it doesn't. Your position doesn't give you that right. Your title doesn't give you that right. Nothing gives you that right. George's mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. For the first time in years, maybe decades, he was speechless. The man who made his entire living asking tough questions, the man who prided himself on never backing down, couldn't defend himself when the tables were turned. He had no response, no comeback, no clever retort. You want to know what I think? Morgan continued, his voice somehow both calm and powerful. I think you've forgotten what real conversation looks like. I think you've spent so much time trying to create viral moments and generate headlines that you've lost sight of what actually matters. Connection, understanding, actual dialogue, actual respect for the people sitting across from you. The silence that followed was absolutely deafening. Everyone in the studio, from the cameraman to the sound technicians to the makeup artist standing in the wings, could feel the weight of what had just been said. This wasn't just about one bad interview. This was about something deeper. Something fundamental about how we treat each other, how we communicate, how we show or fail to show basic human decency. George looked around desperately, as if hoping someone would step in and save him from this moment. A producer, maybe. A commercial break. Anything. But no one moved. Everyone was frozen, watching this unfold in real time. No one knew what to do. No one had ever seen anything like this happen before. You know what, George? Morgan said, his voice calmer now, but somehow even more powerful in its restraint. I came here in good faith. I came here to share something I'm passionate about. I came here believing we would have a real conversation. But you've made it abundantly, perfectly clear that's not what you want. You want conflict. You want drama. You want a soundbite. So I'm going to do something I should have done the moment you started this nonsense. Morgan reached up slowly, deliberately, and unclipped his microphone from his lapel. The small gesture, so simple and ordinary, sent absolute shockwaves through the room. The tiny click of the microphone being unclasped seemed impossibly loud in the stunned silence. Wait, George said quickly, and now there was real panic in his voice. Wait, we can start over. We can talk about your film. That's what you wanted, right? Let's do that. Morgan shook his head slowly, deliberately. No, George. We can't start over. Because this isn't about starting over. This isn't about getting a second chance to pretend you're interested in what I have to say. This is about the way you conduct yourself, the way you treat people who come on your show, the way you think your position gives you license to be disrespectful. And frankly, I don't have time for it. I don't have patience for it. I won't subject myself to it. He placed the microphone carefully on the table between them. The sound it made as it hit the surface seemed impossibly loud in the quiet studio, echoing through the space like a gavel coming down in a courtroom. You can't just leave, George said, his voice now a desperate mix of anger and panic and disbelief. You can't just walk out. We're in the middle of a live broadcast. There are millions of people watching. You have an obligation. Morgan stood up from his chair, his movements dignified and measured despite the absolute chaos his decision was creating around him. He straightened his jacket, looked directly at George, and said simply, calmly, "Watch me." George's face went from flushed red to pale white in an instant. His hands gripped the arms of his chair. This is completely unprofessional. This is unacceptable." Morgan looked down at him, and for a brief moment, there was something almost pitying in his expression. Not contempt, not anger, just pity for someone who had forgotten what professionalism actually meant. Unprofessional? George, what's unprofessional is ambushing a guest who came here in good faith. What's unprofessional is abandoning basic courtesy and respect. What's unprofessional is thinking your position and your platform give you license to be disrespectful to people. What's unprofessional is forgetting that the people who agree to come on your show are doing you a favor, not the other way around. He turned toward the exit, his movements deliberate and calm, projecting an air of absolute certainty about his decision. There was no hesitation in his step, no second guessing. He knew exactly what he was doing and why he was doing it. "Morgan, please," George called after him, his voice cracking slightly, the desperation now completely undisguised. "Let's talk about this. Let's figure this out. Don't do this." Morgan paused at the very edge of the set, just before he would step off and disappear from the camera's view. He looked back one last time, holding George's gaze. "We just did talk about it, George, and you made it very, very clear what kind of conversation you wanted to have. You made it clear that you're more interested in creating drama than having dialogue. I hope it was worth it. I genuinely hope that whatever you were trying to accomplish here was worth losing whatever credibility you had left." With that final statement, he walked off the set. The cameras kept rolling, capturing every second. George sat there, frozen at his desk, his carefully constructed authority and confidence crumbling around him like a house of cards in the wind. The mask had slipped, the facade had fallen, and everyone could see exactly who he really was. The producers in the control room scrambled frantically. Someone yelled to cut to commercial immediately. Others were already on their phones, no doubt calling executives, preparing damage control statements. The audience sat completely frozen, stunned into silence, processing what they had just witnessed with their own eyes. This wasn't supposed to happen. Guests didn't just walk out, especially not guests like Morgan Freeman, especially not on live television, especially not with such calm, devastating precision. But it had happened, and everyone knew exactly why it had happened. There was no ambiguity, no confusion. George had pushed too hard, assumed too much, showed too little respect, and Morgan had responded the only way that made sense, by refusing to participate. George tried desperately to regain some semblance of control, shuffling papers on his desk with shaking hands, adjusting his tie unnecessarily, looking anywhere but at the cameras. But the damage was catastrophically done. His arrogance had been exposed for everyone to see. His tactics had backfired in the most spectacular, public way possible. "Well," George finally managed to say to the camera, his voice strained and unsteady. That was unexpected. We'll be right back after this break." Unexpected. That was the word he chose. Not inappropriate on his part. Not his fault. Not his responsibility. Just unexpected. As if Morgan's reaction had materialized from thin air. As if George himself bore absolutely no responsibility for what had just transpired on his own show, on his own watch. Behind the scenes, Morgan was already in his dressing room, efficiently gathering his belongings. A young production assistant knocked hesitantly on the door, her hand trembling slightly. "Mr. Freeman," she said nervously, her voice barely above a whisper. "The producers, they would really like to speak with you. They're asking if you could please, if you have just a moment." Morgan looked at her kindly, his expression softening. This wasn't her fault. None of this chaos was her fault. She was just doing her job, caught in the middle of something she had no control over. Tell them I've said everything I needed to say. There's nothing left to discuss. But they want to apologize, she stammered. They want to try to fix this somehow. They're saying if you could just give them 5 minutes. Morgan zipped up his bag with finality and turned to face her fully. Some things can't be fixed, he said gently but firmly. This is one of them. George showed me exactly who he is today. He showed everyone who he is. And I'm just choosing to believe him. I'm choosing to respect myself enough to walk away. The assistant nodded slowly, understanding even if she didn't necessarily agree with the decision. Morgan gave her a small, kind smile and moved toward the door, ready to leave this building and this entire situation behind him. As he made his way through the narrow hallways of Good Morning America, past the framed photographs of past guests and memorable moments, crew members stopped what they were doing. Some looked away, embarrassed by what had happened, uncomfortable with the tension. Others met his eyes, and in their expressions, he saw something he hadn't expected. Respect. Deep, genuine respect. They had witnessed the entire thing. They knew the truth. They understood. Back on set, George was trying desperately to move forward with the show, but his energy was completely off. His confidence was shaken to its core. Every word he spoke seemed hollow and forced. Every smile looked painted on and fake. Let's go to our next segment, he said awkwardly, his hands fidgeting with his papers. But nobody was really listening anymore. The viewers at home weren't listening. The audience in the studio wasn't listening. All anyone could think about was what they had just witnessed. Morgan Freeman, a man renowned throughout the world for his grace and wisdom and measured responses, had been pushed too far by George's arrogance. And instead of backing down or playing along, he had stood up for himself with devastating effectiveness. George's next scheduled guest arrived backstage, settling nervously into the chair that Morgan had vacated just minutes earlier. She looked uncertain, glancing at George with obvious worry in her eyes. "Don't worry about that," George said with a strained, unconvincing laugh. "That was just, we had a disagreement about something. These things happen. Let's talk about your new book. That's why you're here." But the guest couldn't hide her extreme discomfort. The whole world had just watched George disrespect one of the most beloved, respected actors alive. Why would she trust that she'd be treated any differently? What guarantee did she have that he wouldn't turn on her the same way? The interview limped along painfully, George asking careful, softball questions, the guest giving short, cautious answers. There was no energy between them, no spark, no connection, just two people going through the awkward motions, trying desperately to pretend that everything was normal and fine. It wasn't normal, it wasn't fine, and it never would be again. The damage was permanent. Outside the building, Morgan climbed into a waiting car, the door closing behind him with a solid thunk. His phone was already buzzing constantly with messages from friends, colleagues, his agent, his publicist. Everyone wanted to know what happened, if he was okay, what he planned to do next, if he needed anything. He ignored the phone for now, letting it buzz away in his pocket. There would be plenty of time for explanations and statements later. Right now, he just wanted to leave this building, this situation, this entire mess behind him. He wanted space to process what had happened. As the car pulled smoothly away from the studio, Morgan looked out the window at the city passing by. He felt no regret about his decision. None whatsoever. He had done exactly what he needed to do. He had drawn a clear line and refused to let it be crossed. That was all. Back inside the studio, the show somehow continued. Commercial breaks came and went. Segments aired on schedule, but the energy never recovered. The tension never fully dissipated. It hung over everything like a dark cloud. George kept glancing unconsciously at the empty chair across from him, as if part of him expected Morgan to return, to say it was all just some kind of elaborate joke, to give them a chance to start fresh. But that chair stayed empty. A physical, undeniable reminder of what George had lost in those 33 seconds when his ego got the better of his judgment. The crew whispered among themselves during commercial breaks. They knew this would be remembered for years. This would be the defining moment people talked about when they talked about George Stephanopoulos. Not his tough political interviews, not his hard-hitting questions, but the time he pushed way too hard and lost everything. When the show finally, mercifully ended, George sat alone at his desk for a long moment after the cameras stopped rolling. The studio emptied around him rapidly. The audience filed out quietly, still processing what they'd seen. The crew began breaking down equipment with unusual speed, everyone wanting to escape the uncomfortable atmosphere. George pulled out his phone, staring at the screen without really seeing anything on it. Part of him wanted to call Morgan directly, to apologize privately, to try to explain himself, but he knew it was far too late for that now. The words had been spoken on live television. The line had been crossed publicly. There was absolutely no going back from this. 33 seconds. That's all it took for everything to fall apart. 33 seconds for George to lose control. 33 seconds for his true character to show. 33 seconds for Morgan Freeman to decide he had had enough. And in those 33 seconds, absolutely everything changed.